Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. My dear listeners, unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue bringing you these adventures. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description and comments. Now, let us dive into the story. The holographic projection bathed the sterile walls of the Vanguard orbital station in a sickly, luminescent purple hue. In the center of the room, a three-dimensional rendering of a jagged, fleshy flora slowly rotated. It cast ominous shadows over the faces of 20 students, representing a dozen different species across the galactic arm. They all shared a single, universal expression: absolute, paralyzing terror. Instructor Kalen Zor paced at the front of the amphitheater. He was a proud reptilian of the Zalari clade, his photosynthetic scales currently shimmering with a stressed, dark obsidian tint. He tapped the control podium with a clawed digit, zooming in on the holographic plant. "Observe the blood tear," Kalen Zor hissed, his voice amplified by the room's acoustic dampeners. "Endemic to the restricted zones of our destination, Aegis 7. This single organism is responsible for more fatalities during field survival tests than starvation and predators combined. Observe the neurotoxic resin glands at the base of its leaves." The hologram zoomed closer, revealing pulsating, crimson veins dripping a simulated translucent sap. The visual alone made several students physically recoil. A nearby avian student fluffed her feathers in a panic response, while a crustacean delegate clicked his mandibles in acute distress. "Just one drop of this resin," Kalen Zor continued, letting the heavy silence amplify his warning. "Will breach the epidermal layer in seconds. It forcefully degrades the cellular walls of your blood vessels, leading to total internal liquefaction in less than 4 minutes. There is no known antidote in the standard medical kit." A suffocating dread settled over the classroom. The air grew heavy, thick with the pheromones of fear, ammonia, and ozone emitted by the diverse alien biology. Then, a rhythmic, wet smacking sound broke the tension. Smack, chew, pop. Edison Bryce, the sole human representative in the Vanguard program, was leaning back in his anti-gravity chair. His uniform jacket was unzipped halfway, and his jaw worked in a steady, repetitive motion, manipulating a synthetic pink substance. A bubble expanded from his lips, popping with a sharp snap that made an adjacent silicon-based lifeform jump in its seat. Edison casually raised a hand. Kalen Zor narrowed his vertical slit pupils. "Yes, Cadet Bryce. Do you have an inquiry regarding the fatal hemorrhage sequence?" "Excuse me," Edison drawled, pointing a lazy finger at the terrifying projection. "Is that plant some kind of roasted chili? Because the chemical readout on the side panel looks awfully familiar. We usually use things with a similar chemical spectrum to marinate flank steak." A dead, horrifying silence dropped over the room. The environmental hum of the space station seemed deafening. Kalen Zor stared at the human. He reached up and tapped his universal translation earpiece, assuming a severe malfunction in the linguistic matrix. When the diagnostic returned a green light, his scales flared an angry, incredulous crimson. "Marinate meat?" Kalen Zor asked slowly, his voice laced with venom. "Are you suggesting your species intentionally consumes a neurotoxic solvent as a culinary enhancement?" "Yeah, it gives it a nice kick." Edison shrugged, completely oblivious to the horror radiating from his peers. "Good for digestion." Kalen Zor let out a sharp hiss of pure frustration. He decided the human was either severely mentally deficient or his species possessed a cultural mandate for suicidal bravado. The instructor aggressively swiped to the next slide on his console. The blood tear vanished, replaced by a grotesque, bulbous fungal growth covered in weeping pores. "Moving on to the parasitic spore sac," Kalen Zor snapped, Do not let the spores touch your mucous membranes. Exposure causes immediate auditory and visual hallucinations, followed rapidly by total respiratory failure as the fungi anchor into your lungs. Edison sat forward, his eyes suddenly lighting up with genuine interest. Oh, neat. That looks exactly like a blue truffle. If you shave it thin over a cream soup, it is absolutely fantastic. This was the breaking point. The students nearest to Edison began to physically panic. A tall, multi-limbed student violently yanked their desk 3 feet away. The avian student covered her beak, looking at Edison not as a classmate, but as a walking biological hazard, a deranged vector of disease. Kalinzor did not argue. He simply pulled out his datapad and made a permanent note in the human's psychological profile. Subject exhibits extreme psychosis and delusional coping mechanisms when confronted with mortal terror. Highly likely to perish on day 1 of the Aegis 7 deployment. Before Kalinzor could transition to the defensive protocols, the sterile white lights of the classroom instantly cut out. A deafening, mechanical shriek tore through the Vanguard orbital station. The floor violently bucked upward. The anti-gravity generators whined, stuttered, and failed. Warning klaxons, blaring a harsh and repetitive synthetic wail, drowned out the screams of the students. Red emergency strobe lights engaged, splashing the chaotic room in colors of blood and urgency. Another massive shockwave hit, this time hurling desks and students across the room. This was no simulation. The deep, guttural roar echoing through the hull plates could only mean one thing. A catastrophic detonation had just ripped through the station's main reactor core, venting the lower decks into the absolute vacuum of space. The safe, theoretical survival class had just shattered into a brutal, terrifying reality. Zero gravity hit with the violence of a physical blow. The artificial mass generators beneath the deck plates died instantly, launching 20 bodies upward into a chaotic, floating tangle of limbs and debris. The air pressure violently equalized, popping eardrums and stealing the breath from their lungs. Strobe lights fractured the darkness into terrifying, microsecond snapshots of pure panic. Kalinzor kicked off the ceiling, his claws tearing into the metal grate to anchor himself. His reptilian eyes darted toward the blasted bulkhead. The scorch marks were angled inward. The station's automated defense turrets had not fired a single shot. This was not a malfunction. It was deliberate, catastrophic sabotage from the inside. "To the pods!" Kalinzor roared, his voice cracking over the blaring klaxons. "Move, do not look back." He physically shoved the paralyzed, floating cadets toward the emergency airlocks. The smell of electrical fires and melting durasteel aggressively assaulted their nasal passages, thick and acrid. Edison Bryce slammed into the padded seat of pod number 4, a heavy safety harness instantly snapping over his chest. 3 other alien cadets piled in beside him, just as the explosive bolts fired. The ejection was brutal. The small metal sphere shot out into the dark void, just as a secondary explosion vaporized the entire eastern wing of the Vanguard orbital station. Inside the pod, the inertial dampeners failed almost immediately. Then came the drop. They hit the upper atmosphere of the planet below, like a bullet striking concrete. The pod shook with a terrifying, rhythmic violence that threatened to rattle their teeth from their gums. The exterior heat shielding screamed, glowing a blinding white hot that illuminated the tiny, claustrophobic cabin. The G-force was crushing, pressing an invisible, suffocating weight onto their chests. For 3 agonizing minutes, they plummeted through the burning sky, surrounded by the deafening roar of atmospheric friction. The impact was a sensory blackout, a deafening crunch of metal, a violent toss forward, and then total stillness. Coughing violently, Kalinzor punched the manual release sequence. The heavy blast doors groaned, sparking as they forced themselves open. Toxic, humid air rushed into the cabin. It smelled like raw copper and rotting sweetness. The survivors stumbled out into the twilight. Out of the 20 who had been in the classroom, Only 12 cadets crawled from the wreckage of the scattered pods. They stood amidst the smoldering debris, their eyes adjusting to the horrifying landscape. It was not a barren wasteland. It was a suffocating, dense jungle of bioluminescent flora. The canopy above glowed with an eerie, pulsing purple light. Twisted vines covered in razor-sharp thorns snaked up massive, fleshy tree trunks. Kalinzor's blood ran cold. The coordinates on his wrist comp confirmed his worst nightmare. They had not just crash-landed. They had been dropped directly onto Aegis 7, the Forbidden World, the exact planetary death trap he had been lecturing about an hour ago. "Check the cargo," Kalinzor ordered, desperation bleeding into his command. A crustacean cadet pried open the emergency compartment of their pod. He pulled back a charred, melted slab of metal. "Instructor, the thermal regulators are completely shattered. The emergency protein rations are incinerated. We have nothing." "Nobody panic," Kalinzor lied, his scales turning an ashen gray. "Seal your environmental suits immediately. Check your helmet locks. Do not touch a single leaf, spore, or root. This entire ecosystem is designed to kill you." A sharp, wet squish interrupted his orders. A young, multi-limbed cadet from the Sirius sector had taken a single step backward in fear. Beneath their boot, a patch of glowing green slime mold ruptured. A tiny puff of translucent gas shot upward, bypassing the cadet's unsealed helmet joint. The cadet gasped. Their eyes rolled back into their head. Within 5 seconds, the left side of their body completely locked up in rigid, agonizing paralysis. They collapsed into the toxic mud, unable to scream, their breathing turning into shallow, terrifying wheezes. Total panic erupted. Cadets scrambled over each other, desperately locking their helmets in place. Kalinzor dragged the paralyzed student away from the mold, frantically tapping his distress beacon. Nothing. The radio emitted only a mocking, endless wave of dead static. The planetary interference was absolute. As the purple sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the true horror of Aegis 7 revealed itself. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. The oppressive humidity turned into a biting, bone-chilling frost. Without the thermal regulators or food to generate internal body heat, the alien cadets began to shiver violently. They huddled together against the cold metal of the crashed pod, their eyes wide with the realization that they were going to freeze to death before the toxins even had a chance to finish them off. Some began to murmur prayers to their forgotten deities. Others simply closed their eyes, surrendering to the creeping numbness of exhaustion and despair. Amidst the whimpering and the static, a sharp hiss of pressurized air echoed sharply. Kalinzor snapped his head up. Edison Bryce was standing at the edge of the clearing. He calmly reached up to his neck, unlatched the heavy pneumatic seals, and pulled his environmental helmet completely off. He tossed it carelessly onto the ground. "Bryce, what are you doing? You will die!" Kalinzor shrieked, his voice raw. Edison did not answer. He reached down to his right boot and pulled out a 6-inch tactical combat dagger. The heavy metal blade caught the purple bioluminescence of the forest. Without a single word, the human turned his back on the group and walked straight into the dark, tangled undergrowth, heading directly toward a massive, glowing red bush of blood tear. By the morning of the third day, the will to live had all but evaporated from the crash site. 72 hours of freezing temperatures and absolute caloric deprivation had ravaged the alien cadets. Their diverse metabolisms, evolved for highly regulated environments, were crashing hard. Several of the reptilian and amphibious students had slipped into a semi-comatose torpor, their bodies shutting down to preserve what little thermal energy remained. Kalinzor leaned heavily against the charred hull of the escape pod. His usually vibrant photosynthetic scales dulled to the color of dead ash. His breathing was shallow. He was composing his final entry in his mental survival log, preparing for the inevitable end. Then, the heavy rustling of the toxic underbrush broke the grim silence. Edison Bryce emerged from the glowing purple fog. He did not look like a man at death's door. He looked like a rugged scavenger returning from a successful hunt. In his arms, he carried a massive, terrifying bounty. There were thick, pulsing roots ripped directly from the blood-tear bushes, bleeding their neurotoxic crimson sap. He had gathered clusters of the weeping parasitic spore sacs, and a dozen neon-yellow acid pods that hissed faintly as they rubbed against his soot-stained uniform. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the conscious survivors. "Bryce, drop those immediately," Kalen Zor rasped, his voice barely more than a dry whisper. "You are holding enough concentrated biological weaponry to eradicate a small city. Have you lost your mind to the hunger?" Edison completely ignored the instructor. He dumped the deadly harvest onto a flat slab of salvaged Durasteel. "Relax, Kalen. I found a freshwater spring about 2 miles east, and we are having a hot breakfast today." Using a frayed power conduit from the pod's wrecked console, Edison struck a spark against a jagged rock, igniting a pile of dried, fibrous alien moss. A campfire crackled to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the terrifying purple flora. He then hauled over a curved, bowl-like section of the pod's heat shielding, filled it with the water he had hauled back in his repurposed helmet, and set it directly over the blazing flames. The alien cadets watched in paralyzed, morbid fascination as the human began his deranged culinary ritual. "Basic organic chemistry," Edison muttered, more to himself than the horrified onlookers. He drew his combat dagger and began slicing the deadly blood-tear roots into thin, uniform medallions. The neurotoxin in this sap is a complex protein peptide. Complex proteins are fragile. You hit them with sustained heat above 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The molecular bonds completely denature. The toxin breaks down into harmless, basic amino acids. It goes from a lethal weapon to a high-protein vegetable. He scraped the bleeding root slices directly into the boiling water. The pot hissed violently, a cloud of crimson steam rising into the freezing air. As for these, Edison picked up the neon-yellow acid pods. They are essentially concentrated citric and hydrochloric acid defense mechanisms. Deadly if you bite into them raw. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of chalky, white dirt. But this planet's riverbanks are lined with heavy alkaline limestone clay. You mix a base with an acid, you get a neutralization reaction. It leaves behind water and a heavy mineral salt. He crushed the clay over the pods and tossed them into the boiling cauldron. Finally, he roughly chopped the blue parasitic spore sacs, tossing them in to thicken the broth. For the first 10 minutes, Kalen Zor was certain they were all going to die just from inhaling the vapors. But as the fire roared and the water boiled down, a profound chemical transformation occurred. The acrid, metallic smell of the toxic jungle began to burn away. In its place, a rich, dense, and overwhelmingly savory aroma began to drift across the camp. It was a smell that bypassed higher reasoning and struck directly at the primitive brainstem. It was spicy, earthy, and dripping with the promise of intense caloric energy. The scent of roasted capsicum, caramelized alien sugars, and deep, umami-rich mushroom broth filled the freezing air. Kalen Zor's stomach let out a violent, undeniable rumble. Around him, the alien cadets began to stir. Their biological imperative to consume calories was violently clashing with their textbook knowledge of the deadly ingredients. The aroma was intoxicating, a siren song of survival. Edison stepped back, wiped a streak of soot from his forehead, and used a curved piece of scrap metal to scoop up the first portion of the dark, bubbling stew. The camp held its collective breath. Kalen Zor braced himself to watch the human's throat dissolve into a bloody ruin. Edison blew on the soup, brought it to his lips, and swallowed heavily. For a second, the human froze. His eyes widened. Then, a massive bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His skin flushed a deep, vibrant red. He let out a sharp, ragged exhale. "Oh, wow!" Edison choked out, his voice slightly raspy. "That packs a serious punch. That is fantastic." He was not dying. In fact, he looked more alive than anyone had in 3 days. The extreme heat of the capsaicinoids in the neutralized blood tear roots was triggering a massive pain response in his mammalian nervous system. In defense, his brain was flooding his body with a tidal wave of endorphins and dopamine. Edison was sweating profusely in the freezing cold, a massive, euphoric grin spreading across his flushed face. He aggressively shoveled another spoonful into his mouth, looking absolutely invigorated. The sight was too much for the starving crew. A loud, clattering sound broke the silence. The crustacean cadet, his chitinous shell trembling violently from the cold and starvation, dragged himself across the frozen dirt toward the campfire. He looked up at Edison, his multifaceted eyes wide with absolute desperation. "Please," the crustacean begged, his mandibles clicking frantically. "I do not care if it kills me. I cannot endure this cold anymore. Give me the poison." Edison smiled gently and handed down a warm, steaming bowl of the dark broth. The crustacean took a desperate gulp. Instantly, he dropped the bowl and let out a terrifying, high-pitched screech. He clutched his throat, thrashing backward into the dirt. "Fire, it is liquid fire, it is burning my insides." Kalinzor lunged forward to help the cadet, cursing the human's madness. But before the instructor could reach him, the crustacean suddenly stopped thrashing. The alien blinked. He slowly sat up, looking down at his own chest. The agonizing burning sensation in his throat was radiating outward, transforming into a massive, surging wave of internal heat. The bone-deep chill of Aegis 7 that had been slowly killing him was violently pushed back by the sheer thermal output of the spicy broth. His shivering ceased entirely. The crustacean looked at the spilled soup, then up at Edison. Thick, viscous tears of absolute relief began to leak from his compound eyes. "It is warm," he whispered in sheer disbelief. "I am warm." He scrambled forward and began frantically licking the spilled broth from the dirt, weeping with a profound, unprecedented satisfaction. That was the breaking point. The dam of rational fear shattered under the weight of primal hunger and the desperate need for warmth. One by one, the alien cadets crawled, limped, and dragged themselves toward the human and his pot of neutralized biological weapons. An hour later, the scene around the campfire was entirely surreal. The survivors were huddled together, all sweating profusely in the sub-zero temperatures, their faces flushed in various shades of alien physiology. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the aggressive slurping of spicy root stew. Sitting against a log, Kalinzor held his own bowl with trembling claws. He took another sip. The searing pain hit his tongue first, followed immediately by a rush of pure, life-saving heat and energy. It was simultaneously the most agonizing and the most delicious thing he had ever consumed. He pulled out his surviving datapad and began to type out a new entry for his survival log. His hands were steady for the first time in days. He documented the chemical breakdown, the neutralization of the acids, and the psychological impact of the endorphin rush. He looked over at Edison Bryce, who was currently arguing with an avian cadet about whether the soup needed more alien salt. Kalinzor took another long, burning sip of the lethal stew, looking at the human not as a delusional cadet, but with a profound mixture of absolute terror and undeniable, reverent respect. By the time the purple sun set on their sixth night stranded, a grim stability had settled over the camp. The alien cadets were asleep, their bellies full of the neutralized botanical stew. Edison had grabbed his repurposed helmet and headed east toward the freshwater spring to replenish their supply for the morning. Kalinzor, unable to sleep, decided to run a final diagnostic on the salvaged command console of their crashed pod. The instructor pried open the secondary maintenance panel, hoping to reroute some residual battery power to the thermal dampeners. He illuminated the dark circuitry with a chemical glow stick. What he saw made the blood freeze in his reptilian veins. The primary distress beacon was not shattered from the impact. It had been meticulously repaired. The frayed optic cables were spliced together perfectly, and the power matrix was completely realigned. Yet, the transmission switch had been physically jammed with a tiny, specialized carbon wedge, and the antenna feed was cleanly severed by a laser cutter. Someone had fixed the radio days ago and deliberately silenced it. The station explosion was not a random act of terror. They were marooned here on purpose, and the saboteur was sleeping right next to them. I was wondering when you would check the lower deck panels. Instructor? A voice echoed from the shadows of the crashed pod. Kalen Zor spun around, his claws instinctively extending. Stepping into the dim orange glow of the dying campfire was Zyril. Throughout the past 6 days, the Seraph cadet had been quiet, disciplined, and unassuming, keeping his large, spiked wings tightly folded beneath his environmental cloak. Now, the cloak was discarded. Zyril stood tall, his posture no longer that of a terrified student, but of a hardened, military-trained operative. In his hand, he held a sleek, unauthorized plasma pistol, aimed directly at Kalen Zor's chest. "You!" Kalen Zor hissed, the pieces violently clicking into place. "The reactor overload on the Vanguard orbital station. It was you!" "The Separatist Coalition pays exceptionally well for discretion," Zyril replied, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any guilt or hesitation. Blowing the station was merely a distraction to ensure my escape pod landed precisely at these coordinates without orbital tracking. Zyril took a slow, deliberate step closer, his spiked wings flaring slightly to cast a monstrous silhouette over the sleeping camp. "You taught us well in the classroom, Instructor. You taught us that Aegis 7 was an evolutionary anomaly, a death trap of toxic flora. But you academic fools missed the truth. This planet did not evolve naturally. It was engineered." Kalen Zor stared at him, his mind racing to find a way to disarm the mercenary. "This entire ecosystem," Zyril gestured toward the glowing purple canopy above them, "is a biological vault. The lethal plants, the acidic pods, the hallucinogenic spores, they are merely the outer security perimeter. They were planted here millennia ago by a forgotten empire to protect the real weapon hidden deep within the planetary crust." Zyril reached into his tactical harness and pulled out a heavy, lead-lined cylindrical canister. It hummed with a dark, terrible energy. "They called it the Black Breath," Zyril whispered, a fanatical gleam in his dark eyes. "A dormant bacterial spore engineered to instantly dissolve neural pathways. It can wipe out the nervous system of an entire continent in a matter of hours, leaving the infrastructure perfectly intact. My employers want it, and I just successfully extracted it from the ruins 3 miles south of here." "You cannot leave this planet," Kalen Zor growled, shifting his weight. "The orbital blockade will detect your launch. They will detect a tragic survivor, finally getting the distress beacon to work." Zyril corrected him smoothly. "A sole survivor of a terrible crash. Such a shame the rest of the crew succumbed to the toxic environment before the rescue team arrived." Kalen Zor glanced at the sleeping cadets. "You did not eat the humans' food today, or yesterday." Zyril sneered in absolute disgust. "I am a professional operative. I have been surviving on concealed, military-grade nutrient patches since day one. I would never ingest that unholy, agonizing sludge the primate boils in the dirt. But it is time to end this miserable camping trip." Before Kalen Zor could lunge, Zyril reached into his belt and unclipped a spherical black grenade. He twisted the activation cap and tossed it directly into the center of the sleeping camp. It did not explode with fire. It popped with a soft, sinister hiss. A thick, oily black mist erupted from the canister, expanding with unnatural speed. It washed over the campfire, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. The mist swept over the sleeping alien cadets like a tidal wave of death. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. There was no coughing. There was no thrashing. The moment the black breath spores touched their skin or entered their respiratory tracts, their nervous systems simply collapsed. The crustacean cadet went entirely rigid, his limbs locking in place. The avian student's eyes rolled back, her breathing halting as her diaphragm completely froze. Kalen Zor tried to hold his breath, but the spores absorbed straight through his photosynthetic scales. A terrible, icy shockwave ripped down his spine. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed hard onto the frozen dirt, completely paralyzed from the neck down. He could see. He could hear. But his body was a dead weight. The great survival instructor was reduced to a helpless spectator, waiting for his own heart to stop beating. Zyril walked leisurely through the black fog, completely unaffected thanks to the hidden rebreather mask he had slipped over his face. He stepped over the paralyzed bodies of his former classmates, making his way toward Kalen Zor. He aimed the glowing muzzle of his plasma pistol directly between the instructor's reptilian eyes. "Nothing personal, Instructor," Zyril said softly. "Just tying up loose ends." He began to squeeze the trigger. Crunch. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a combat boot crushing a dry leaf echoed through the silent, spore-filled clearing. Zyril froze. He spun around, aiming his pistol into the dark fog. Stepping out from the thickest part of the black breath cloud was Edison Bryce. The human carried a heavy bucket of water in one hand. He was not wearing a mask. He was not wearing a helmet. He was breathing the deadliest, most concentrated neural bioweapon in the galaxy directly into his bare lungs. Edison looked at the paralyzed aliens, then looked at Zyril. He blinked, completely unaffected, and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Man," Edison grumbled, setting the water bucket down with a heavy thud. "I leave for 20 minutes to get some water, and you guys start a pesticide party without me." Zyril stared through the visor of his tactical rebreather, his eyes wide with an impossible, staggering realization. He watched the human inhale a lungful of the concentrated black breath spores, fully expecting the primate to instantly drop to the frozen dirt with a liquefied brainstem. Instead, Edison Bryce merely blinked, looking mildly annoyed by the sudden lack of visibility in the camp. "How?" Zyril whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, unfamiliar dread. "That is a Class 9 biological weapon. Your nervous system should be completely disintegrating." Edison reached his tongue into his cheek, chewed for a second, and casually spat a wad of pulpy, dark red root fiber onto the ground. The neutralized blood-tear pulp hissed softly against the frozen soil. "You really should have tried the soup, man," Edison said, his voice completely steady. "For the last 6 days, my entire diet has consisted of raw, neurotoxic alkaloids, highly concentrated citric acids, and enough capsaicinoids to melt a standard engine block. My human immune system did not just adapt. It went into a state of absolute, hyperactive overdrive. My bloodstream is practically boiling with extreme chemical antibodies and massive inflammatory response cells. Your ancient, fancy bacterial spores just hit a literal wall of hostile, weaponized biology. They are burning up the second they touch the inside of my lungs." Zyril let out a furious, guttural roar. He violently dropped the empty spore canister. He reached toward his chest rig and slammed his fist into a concealed activation panel. Instantly, the mercenary's environmental cloak retracted. Beneath it, hidden microservos whined to life with a terrifying mechanical screech. Thick, interlocking plates of carbon-weave power armor snapped into place, expanding outward to encase Zyril in a highly advanced, heavily mechanized exoskeleton. The spiked wings on his back flared wide, crackling with a deadly electrostatic charge. He raised his plasma pistol, the weapon humming with a blinding, superheated blue light. The fight that erupted was an absolute nightmare of asymmetric warfare. Zyril fired. A bolt of screaming blue plasma tore through the exact space where Edison's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The superheated projectile slammed into a nearby tree trunk, instantly vaporizing a massive chunk of the wood and sending burning splinters raining down in every direction. Edison dove, hard to his right, hitting the frozen dirt and rolling desperately to avoid a second shot that melted the very earth he had just touched. He had nothing but his standard-issue Vanguard combat dagger. He was fighting a heavily armored, mechanically augmented super soldier with a firearm that could melt solid titanium. "You are just a primitive animal," Zyril screamed, tracking the human's frantic movements with his advanced targeting visor. "Your biology is a fluke. You cannot outrun a plasma bolt." Edison knew he was hopelessly outmatched in an open clearing. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing heat radiating from the scorched earth, and sprinted violently into the darkest, most terrifying section of the glowing purple undergrowth. Zyril did not hesitate. He stomped after the human, his heavy mechanical boots effortlessly crushing the glowing moss beneath him. He fired blindly into the dark, toxic foliage, his plasma blasts illuminating the twisted vines and massive, weeping fungal growths. Deep inside the thicket, the air was suffocatingly humid and reeked of metallic poison. Edison pressed his back against the slimy bark of a massive tree, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He needed an equalizer. He glanced down at his short steel blade, then looked frantically around the deadly environment. Just 2 feet to his left, pulsing with a sinister crimson light in the darkness, was a massive cluster of raw, untouched blood tear pods. These were the very same glands Kalinzor had warned would liquefy a biological entity in 4 minutes. The resin was weeping heavily from the leaves, thick and deadly. Edison sheathed his combat knife between his teeth. He took a deep, agonizing breath. Humans were crazy, but this was a completely new frontier of insanity. Without any protective gloves, Edison reached out and grabbed the fleshy, toxic pods with his bare hands. The biological reaction was horrific. The raw resin instantly breached his epidermal layer. The pain was absolute and immediate. It felt as though he had plunged his hands into a vat of boiling, concentrated sulfuric acid. The flesh of his palms began to blister rapidly, turning a sickly, bruised purple as the neurotoxin aggressively attacked his blood vessels. But Edison did not scream. For a solid week, he had forced his body to process the most agonizing, fiery culinary concoctions this death world had to offer. He had subjected his pain receptors to the absolute extreme limits of capsaicin-induced torture, purely for the sake of a hot meal. His brain, already flooded with unprecedented levels of pain-blocking endorphins from his daily diet, forcefully intercepted the agony. He gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles bulging with immense strain, and violently ripped the glowing red pods directly from the stem. He grabbed his combat dagger and mercilessly squeezed the pods over the steel. The thick, raw, neurotoxic sap coated the blade, dripping with a deadly, pulsing red light. "I have thermal tracking." Bryce, Zyril's mechanically amplified voice, boomed through the jungle. Heavy footsteps crushed the underbrush just a few yards away. "My armor is rated to withstand a direct artillery strike. You cannot hide, and your little metal toy cannot even scratch my paint." Zyril stepped into the clearing, aiming his glowing pistol directly at the massive tree where Edison was hiding. Edison lunged. He launched himself from the shadows with explosive, desperate force, closing the distance before Zyril could fully aim and fire. The human swung his heavily coated dagger directly at the center of Zyril's mechanized chest plate. Zyril did not even attempt to dodge. He barked a cruel laugh, fully preparing to let the pathetic blade shatter against his advanced kinetic shielding. The steel knife struck the carbon weave armor, but it did not shatter. The raw, living enzymes of the blood tear resin, a biological solvent designed by an ancient empire to forcefully dissolve absolutely anything it touched, violently reacted with the synthetic polymers of the armor. The tactical twist was devastating. The reaction was not kinetic. It was purely chemical. The highly advanced, bulletproof, heat-resistant plating instantly began to hiss and bubble violently. The molecular bonds of the carbon weave simply snapped under the extreme, aggressive biological degradation. The impenetrable armor melted away like wet tissue paper under the glowing red edge of Edison's coated blade. Zyral's mocking laughter abruptly turned into a high-pitched shriek of absolute, blind panic. He stared down in horror as his invincible exoskeleton dissolved into a smoking, useless chemical sludge across his chest. He frantically tried to raise his plasma pistol, but Edison was already moving for the lethal kill. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Edison twisted his wrist, driving the heavily coated dagger directly upward. He bypassed the dissolving chest plate entirely and buried the blade deep into the soft, unarmored gap at the joint of Zyral's neck collar. The raw blood-tear resin flooded directly into the mercenary's exposed bloodstream. Zyral dropped his heavy weapon. His eyes widened in absolute terror as the most lethal bioweapon on the planet surged through his veins. There was zero time for his body to process the shock. Massive, catastrophic anaphylactic shock hit him instantly. The mercenary collapsed backward onto the frozen dirt, completely immobilized, his nervous system completely shutting down in a matter of seconds. He had just been brutally taken down by a primate, wielding what amounted to extremely aggressive cooking spices. Edison violently pulled his blade free, stumbling backward away from the fallen body. The combat adrenaline rapidly dumped from his system. The extreme pain in his hands finally crashed forcefully over his mental barriers. His fingers were horribly burned, heavily blistered, and shaking uncontrollably. He dropped the ruined dagger, falling heavily to his knees. The severe chemical burns and sheer physical exhaustion threatened to pull him into a deep, dark unconsciousness. But as the deafening silence of the jungle returned, a horrifying sound drifted from the campsite behind him. It was a wet, rattling, desperate choking noise. Edison forced his heavy head to turn. Through the dissipating black fog of the mercenary's chemical grenade, he saw Kalen Zor and the surviving alien cadets. They were no longer just safely paralyzed. Their bodies were locked in rigid, agonizing convulsions. Thick, white foam was bubbling violently from their mouths and breathing spiracles. The black breath spores were entering their final, fatal stage. The entire crew was seconds away from total neural death. Edison crawled through the dissipating black fog. His blistered hands screamed in agony, but the rattling breaths of his classmates forced him to keep moving. He reached Kalen Zor. The instructor's scales were turning a terrifying, necrotic gray. The black breath spores were rapidly dissolving his neural pathways. There was no medical kit. There was no laboratory to synthesize a cure. There was only the brutal, unforgiving chemistry of the jungle. Edison looked at the remaining raw blood tear pods scattered on the ground. A crazy, desperate theory formed in his mind. The alien spores were an ancient biological weapon designed to thrive in cold, dormant environments. Heat was their natural enemy, but he did not have the 20 minutes required to neutralize the pods over the fire. He needed to generate massive, instantaneous internal heat inside the aliens' bodies, or they would all be dead in less than 60 seconds. He was about to commit the ultimate medical heresy. Ignoring the searing pain in his raw palms, Edison grabbed a handful of the fresh, unneutralized red pods. He dragged himself over to his bucket of fresh spring water. He violently crushed the lethal plants directly into the liquid, squeezing every last drop of the concentrated capsaicin and raw neurotoxic resin into the water. It turned a dark, aggressive crimson. He hauled the bucket over to the paralyzed survival instructor. Edison grabbed Kalen Zor by the jaw, forcefully prying the reptilian's mouth open. "I am really sorry about this. Teach," Edison muttered. But you are going to want to drink this. He poured the raw, burning liquid directly down Kalinzor's throat. He did not wait for a reaction. He frantically scrambled to the crustacean, the avian, and the rest of the dying cadets, forcing the spicy, toxic slurry into their mouths. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The clearing was completely silent. Then, Kalinzor's eyes snapped wide open. The instructor's body violently bucked off the ground. The sheer, unadulterated heat of the raw capsaicin hit his delicate internal organs like a thermonuclear blast. His dormant metabolism panicked to fight the agonizing sensation of liquid fire. His brain triggered a massive, system-wide inflammatory response. His internal body temperature skyrocketed in a matter of seconds. The crustacean let out a deafening screech, his legs kicking wildly. The avian cadet shot up, violently coughing out a thick cloud of dead, black dust. Edison's insane gamble was working. The extreme thermal shock generated by the spicy resin was literally cooking the temperature-sensitive bacterial spores from the inside out. The black breath weapon, designed to quietly paralyze, was completely eradicated by the chaotic, blazing inferno of the human's improvised hot sauce. Kalinzor gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs, his scales flushing a vibrant, healthy green mixed with the bright red of extreme spice tolerance. When the rescue dropship from the Galactic Alliance finally pierced through the heavy planetary clouds the next morning, the medical team rushed down the ramp with body bags prepared. They expected to find a camp full of frozen, poisoned corpses. Instead, the heavily armed rescue medics stopped dead in their tracks, completely horrified and utterly confused. Sitting in a circle around a roaring campfire were the 12 surviving cadets and their instructor. Every single one of them was sweating profusely in the freezing morning air. Their lips were swollen to comical proportions, and they were all panting heavily, eyes watering. Yet, they were passing around a large metal bowl, happily slurping down a dark, thick root stew. Edison Bryce sat among them, stirring the pot with his bandaged hands, offering a polite nod to the stunned rescue team. 1 month later, the sterile white lights of the Vanguard Central Infirmary hummed quietly. Kalinzor sat up in his recovery bed, his physical strength fully restored. He looked across the room. Edison was lounging comfortably on his own bed, casually tossing bright red, dried earth chilies into his mouth from a plastic bag, crunching on them like sweet candies. A profound wave of emotion washed over the reptilian instructor. For his entire career, he had believed that survival in the galaxy depended entirely on advanced technology, strict protocols, and avoiding danger at all costs. But watching the human, Kalinzor realized the terrifying, brilliant truth. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology. It was their sheer, stubborn audacity. It was their uncanny ability to look at the universe's most hostile, unforgiving cruelty and stubbornly figure out a way to turn it into their own strength. Kalinzor pulled his digital datapad onto his lap. He opened the official, galaxy-wide Vanguard Survival Handbook. He navigated to the entry for Aegis 7, specifically the section detailing the blood tier plant. He highlighted the massive, red warning label that read, "Extremely toxic flora, fatal upon contact." With a slight, respectful smile, the instructor deleted the entire paragraph. He typed a new entry, hitting submit to broadcast the update to the entire Galactic Council. In offices and academies across the stars, highly decorated generals and scholars read the new official protocol and fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The new entry simply read, Hazard Level 5. Unless you are accompanied by a human, in that case, hand them a frying pan and call it dinner. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story. My wonderful audience. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this wild adventure and want to help our channel survive YouTube's demonetization, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or the pinned comment. That single dollar goes directly to paying our hardworking team, helping them feed their families, and allowing us to keep creating more amazing sci-fi stories for you every single week. Thank you again, and stay safe out there in the galaxy.